Today, we have a very, very, very special guest. This is a young man who is everywhere on the streets of ESPN. He's breaking news. He's in our faces on TV 24/7. He's grinding the fantasy streets. It is truly one of us, except much more professional. It is indeed the one and only Field Yates. Field, how's it going today, buddy? Thanks for doing the show.
It's great to be on with you guys. I got 3 varies, so now I'm fired up. I better live up to the hype here. A little nervous that I won't, but I'll do my very best. Great to be on with you guys. Love seeing you guys continue to crush it, and love reading your draft content. What I liked about your draft content most is that you guys just call it how you see it, right? There's no filter to what you feel about players. You're not necessarily in the business of trying to get to the bottom of the football character on these guys or trying to necessarily say for sure where these guys are going to go in the draft. You're just evaluating the players and what you think of them, and then just kind of offering your opinion about what they could be as fantasy football players down the road. So I love following along. It certainly helped me in my own prep for the draft, and I'm glad we get to talk rookies today.
The way we're going to do this is I rank the top 20 landing spots for this rookie class with roughly 95% redraft, 5% dynasty in mind. I rank them for landing spot only. Now, this is a very rough ranking, so we're going to debate and dissect the landing spots for each. And my God, Field, I was excited for Brock Bowers. I think he may have caught the worst possible landing spot he could have spot. I have this 20th, dead last among the top 20 for landing spots here with the Raiders. You have Michael Mayer there, and you have quarterbacks are Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. Do you think this is worst possible outlook for Brock Bowers, Field? And what do you think about this landing spot?
It's fairly low on the list here. So if you're prioritizing what could have been perfect for Brock Bowers, ideal scenario 1 was great quarterback, but no clear number 1 pass catcher in the offense. It was hard to find that around the NFL, but there might have been 1 or 2 landing spots. Second best scenario would be great quarterback, number 2 pass catching option. Maybe that was the Jets if they had taken him at number 10 with Aaron Rodgers now healthy. Number 3 would be, hey, maybe the quarterback play was a question mark, but he's at least the unquestioned number 1 pass catcher. And it feels like Brock Bowers hit none of those scenarios, right? He instead goes to a team that he is, I think, maybe the number 3 pass catcher. Devontae Adams still the alpha in that offense. Jacoby Myers balled out last year. There's a chance that Brock Bowers is a 3rd leading target getter behind those 2 players. And he has to split snaps, or at least be on the field at the same time as Michael Mayer with a team that has a quarterback question mark. I guess Gardner Minshew would be my bet on who ends up starting for them in week 1. But I felt like maybe the Raiders took Brock Bowers in part because none of the quarterbacks were available at number 13. And maybe in their mind, they were expecting to go that position rather than tight end / offensive weapon.
What do you think about the possibility of a team reaching out to the Raiders and trying to trade for Michael Mayer? Or do you think that they are committed to using both tight ends? See, in the NFL, it's really hard for teams to play more, 2 tight end sets more than 50% of the time? Even 50% is a lot. So do you think that Michael Mayer could get traded?
My guess would be that it would have to take such a rich package. When I say rich, I'm not talking about a 1st-round pick, but they used the 37th or somewhere in the 30s last year on Mayer. Might have been maybe 40 or 41. Bottom line, it was within the first 10 or 11 picks of the 2023 NFL draft. He's going to cost nothing because 2nd-round picks have such modest contracts relative to guys that have been on the open market that I think Tom Telesco, their new GM, is I get it. He's not going to play as big of a role now that Brock Bowers is here as he would have without Brock, but a controlled commodity at an important position for us. It's good to have depth. If you're not going to give us a 2nd-round pick to recoup what we used on him, even though it was a different regime, then I'm not going to be bothered with your trade offer. So teams probably will call. I'd be surprised, though, if the Chargers let him go, the Raiders, Telesco, of course, the old Chargers GM. I'd be surprised if the Raiders traded him absent some sort of blow-you-over trade package.
Because they have Harrison Bryant, too.
Yeah, I know. I wonder. So that tells you that they spent this draft cycle probably thinking Brock Bowers wasn't going to be there at number 13, which I don't think was a crazy thought by them. Or they spent this draft cycle thinking Brock Bowers may be there at number 13, but we don't think all 6 quarterbacks will also be gone if Brock Bowers is still available at number 13. Maybe 1 or 2 of those top 6 quarterbacks are still sitting there when we are on the clock.
Yeah. We would have had Brock Bowers probably ranked in the 70s or 80s it would different with a better landing spot, the Jets or something like that. We now have him way down at tight end 11, 112 overall. So pretty horrific landing spot
Yeah, I
for
think I
Brock
had him
Bowers.
12 or 13 in my initial run of ranks. I'm still kind of catching up. Admittedly, I'm still like finalizing my ranks just because my brain has been so accustomed to thinking draft rankings, NFL draft rankings, not fantasy draft rankings. But
For sure.
I think 12 or 13 was around where I landed with Brock Bowers in my first run as well. So we see this one similarly.
All right, let's go to number 19
Yep.
here on the top 20 landing spots. Number 19, A.D. Mitchell goes to the Colts. I'm curious what you heard on his slide, Field, because the narrative out there is that A.D. Mitchell was going to be a first-round pick. Adam Schefter came on this very podcast
Remember that.
and said that NFL teams were going to be all over A.D. Mitchell. He ends up sliding to 52 overall, and the narrative is that it was character, bad interview. He's not handling his type 1 diabetes well. I don't know, but regardless, I don't like this really landing spot that much either with Michael Pittman there, with them being really run heavy with Anthony Richardson and JT. So I guess Field first, why do you think A.D. Mitchell slipped? And second, what do you think about this landing spot?
Yeah, I had him 19 on the big board. So I was surprised by the second round fall for A.D. Mitchell. And I saw the impassioned plea from Chris Ballard, their GM, after the draft saying, hey, this kind of stuff is a bunch of bull crap. If you're going to do it, put your name to it. That being said, I think there's something to it, right? I can't speak to the diabetes portion of the potential slide. I saw that reporting. I believe that was on, it was Bob McGinn, right, on Go Long, who had that intel. I can't speak to that because I didn't hear it personally. But, some maturity concerns I certainly did hear throughout the pre-draft process with A.D. Mitchell. But that's not that uncommon for draft prospects. These guys are 21, 22 years old. And up until recently, these guys became, overnight millionaires when they got to the NFL. Now these guys already are in some cases. And candidly, I'm not sure I'd be the most mature version of myself if I was 20 years old and I had a Benz or a Lambo to drive around and, $500,000 of disposable cash to work with too. So I was still surprised though by A.D. Mitchell's slide because I thought there was a case that he was the clear-cut fourth best wide receiver. I think he's a more complete player right now than Brian Thomas Jr. BT ends up at going 23rd. He's got this elite speed and great second gear, accelerating down the field. But 80's special. The landing spot, though, not so special because of what you discussed. I mean, Michael Pittman Jr. had one of the most interesting, fascinating kind of career pivots last year. He's always been a really good player, but Shane Steichen, when he took over as their head coach, and I give him a ton of credit for this, was just that guy's our best player, so we're going to force feed the crap out of him. I mean, the number of wide receiver screens he ran last year, he was, to me, the most consistent player in fantasy football outside of the guys that were, the first 10 off, CMC, Amon-Ra, players like that, right? Pittman just every single week last year, it was 10, 12, 13 targets every single week. So you factor in that. Josh Downs, who was also just feasting on targets when he was healthy for half of the season, the desire to run the football with JT, not perfect for AD, not terrible either. I think he'll end up becoming their second wide receiver. He's going to have to earn that though, so it won't happen right out of the gates.
Yeah, Pittman had 156 targets in 16 games last year. It's almost 10 targets a game. And then they signed him to a 3-year, $68 million extension. So I don't think he's going anywhere as the focal point of their RPO-heavy offense.
Yeah, we're down at 149th overall right now on A.D. Mitchell in the ranks. Let's go to 18 overall. Xavier Legette lands with the Panthers, and they traded up for him. And I think the concern with this landing spot is, maybe Bryce Young is just bad. I'm curious what Field thinks about that. Maybe Bryce Young just is not salvageable. And then Deontay Johnson's always going to be open. Thielen is still there. So, Field, what do you think about Bryce Young this year? Can he salvage this past game and the landing spot for Xavier Legette?
My answer is yes, in terms of Bryce salvaging things. And I'm going to give you a very non-nuanced answer. Last year was obviously a complete shit show for the Panthers. They fired their coach after 10 games. And prior to that, by the way, prior to firing Frank Reich, they switched play callers twice, right? They gave the play calling duties to Thomas Brown, then they gave him back to Frank Reich. So clearly this was a disaster pretty much from Jump Street for Carolina. Might have been too many voices in the ear of Bryce Young as opposed to just one very clear, direct line to Bryce every single snap. So I'm just going to trust my pre-draft evaluation of Bryce and feeling like he merited number 1 overall pick status a season ago before I cut bait. But I will say this, The Panthers, with all they've done this offseason, and I get it, they don't have, this is not to be confused with Joe Burrow's 3-man receiver core early in his career with Jamar and T and, maybe a better version of Tyler Boyd. But there's a more credible supporting cast around Bryce Young that after this season, the Panthers will probably know whether the possibility of them being back in the quarterback market exists or not. And if Bryce doesn't play well, they probably will have a top 5 or 7 pick this year, and they probably will be in that quarterback market. As far as Leggett though goes, it's a more crowded receiver room than might be preferred. The responsibility of the Panthers this year though is just find touches for Xavier Leggett. If there's sort of drawbacks to his game, it's how much refinement does he have as a route runner for a guy that had just basically 1 year of college production at South Carolina, 71 catches last year, 42 in the 4 years prior to that. I'm finding a way or ways to get on the football all the time because he is lightning in a bottle. He is a big play waiting to happen. I thought maybe the most explosive player not named Malik Neighbors with the football in his hands last year.
The Bryce Young thing, if it continues to go bad, David Tepper might lose his mind. Have you guys seen the videos of this guy? This guy's losing. He is absolutely melting down. If Bryce Young doesn't turn around this year, I'm worried about this guy. This guy's gonna completely melt down.
I know, man. Yeah, that was tough. That was a tough look. It sounded like that video that went viral of him at the restaurant just prior to the draft might have been in jest, but you just don't want to be involved in those videos too frequently.
Psycho.
Well, hats off to your analysis there, Field.
I hope you had that one queued up before the show.
And also, the Xavier Leggett. Also, there's a video out there of Xavier Leggett's press conference. That accent that he has is so good. It's so good. Thor tweeted the Waterboy reference. It's so good.
If it wasn't for the Keon Coleman presser, we'd be talking a lot more about that Leggett presser because it was awesome.
All right. Let's go to number 17. Blake Corum lands with the Rams. Now, I thought this was an interesting one because Sean McVay prefers to commit to one guy and stick with it. Todd Gurley obviously had some outrageous seasons, as did other running backs. Lately, it's been, or at least last season, it was Kyren. Now, I don't think it's a great landing spot for Blake Corum in that he can supplant or will supplant Kyren anytime soon. I do think maybe it's better than expected because if anything happens to Kyren, and given the workload Kyren's had, including special teams, something could certainly happen to Kyren. And then maybe Corum becomes the guy that McVay really loves. So what do you think about Corum's fit in the McVay system, Field, and any other thoughts on Corum to the Rams?
Yeah, I'll say so you laid out the upside if something happens to Kyren, which is probably the most important point. But the other thing that I'll note is the Rams use a 3rd-round pick on Blake Corum, which I don't think he was going to go in the 5th round, especially with the Chargers, kind of hovering as the most obvious suitor for Blake Corum ever. Jim Harbaugh, and I know that he has a propensity for hyping up his players, JJ and the best quarterback in the draft talk and things like that. He loves Blake Corum like maybe no other player he's ever coached. I mean, he is just mad about Blake Corum. So I think Blake Corum could have gone, top of the 4th round, but the Rams used a 3rd-round pick on him. This is a legit investment for a team that for the first time in 8 years had a 1st-round pick. They have shown over the past few drafts that they are not as concerned about thresholds and minimums. Instead, they're just going to find players they think are good football players that help them, and more often than not, right away. So this probably it's a slight. I use the word slight by design discount for Kyren Williams, but not a terrible spot for Blake Corum. I thought he was going to end up as a backup anyways, but to me, it's he's got a very, very clear role to start and a potentially monster role if something happens to Kyren.
Also, the Rams have invested heavily in their interior offensive line. I mean, they've got some beefy boys in the middle. They signed Kevin Dotson. They signed Jonah Jackson from Detroit. They're kicking Steve Avila, he's going to be one of the biggest centers in the league. On the interior, Rob Havenstein can run block. So if Blake Corum does get the opportunity, which I don't think he will, barring a Kyren injury, but an opportunity to be the full-time back, he could take off.
We do have to pour one out, though, for those games last year where Kyren is playing literally 98% of the snaps. There was a Thursday night game they played relatively late in the season, And it was like Kyron like got poked in the eye and he left the field, and it was like a national catastrophe because the guy hadn't left the field for like 6 straight games. He was back like 2 snaps later. I happen to remember this well because Shefty, I loved his appearance with you guys recently. I was a big Kyron investor last year. He's been a big Kyron guy for 2 years now. And I mean, he was so all in on Kyron that we were living through it on our group thread of just like, oh, there goes Shefty. Like, Shefty crying right now, Shefty panicking right now. He was back just a couple of snaps later, but safe to say the Schefter residents for a moment kind of had like an eerie chill to it, waiting to see what the result of that eye poking was.
So good. Okay, let's go to 16 overall. We're going to talk about Jalen Polk. I hope I didn't butcher the first name.
You nailed that one.
Okay, perfect. So obviously, when it comes to Patriots stuff, I think Field is as plugged in as anyone. I first want to ask you, Field, it's hard to evaluate Polk without knowing who's going to start at quarterback. Do you think it'll be Drake May or Jacoby Brissett? And then you could make a case that Polk landing spot should be higher because they weren't going to have anyone else. We're talking about Kendrick Bourne off the ACL, Pop Douglas, KJ Osborne, Juju Smith. Like, it's not hard for Polk to become the number one receiver here. In that sense, it's a good landing spot. I'm just worried about overall this team just being a mess and the quarterback situation. So our Patriots guy, Field, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, teams that draft a young quarterback with a veteran already in place or a veteran signed like Jacoby Brissett was usually have the same refrain, which is that the veteran will start the season. It's his team. We feel as though there is valuable experience to be gained from watching from the sideline. I think the Patriots are a bit more serious about that than a lot of teams often end up being, because we see it all the time, right? I mean, the Bears back in the day when they drafted Mitch Trubisky had Mike Glennon, and it was going to be, hey, Glennon's going to take the reins to start. And then Mitch has like this awesome preseason game, and it's like the chorus from the fan base is so loud. And what happens too is like owners like hear these things. I'm sure the Bears ownership was like, well, if everybody wants us to play him, this guy's unbelievable. Why shouldn't we do it? I think that, and that happens all the time, it feels like. Didn't Urban Meyer have like a competition, so to speak, for Gardner Minshew and Trevor Lawrence? Can you imagine the Khan family being like, really, we're going to have this number one pick not start right out of the gates? I think the Patriots are pretty dedicated to Jacoby Brissett as their early season starter. Drake May was probably of the top 6 quarterbacks, along with J.J. McCarthy, the biggest developmental prospect. I think the upside's way better for Drake May than it is with J.J. McCarthy. Environments are certainly going to impact that, but Drake just turned 21 in January. Like, there's reason to believe it might be smart for him to take a little bit of there's a little bit of an ingratiation period, whether that's 3 games, 6 games, 16 games. I'd be surprised if it's that long, but I think Jacoby Brissett will start out of the chutes. But Drake May is going to have some moments during the preseason or during training camp, because regardless of where you landed on the evaluation, the best version of Drake May is as impressive as any quarterback in the class. The kid is he's a monster. Like, that arm is ridiculous. He's a sick athlete as well. It's going to be really hard to resist that temptation for the Patriots, because he will have some moments during training camp and during the preseason. But I really believe Jacoby Brissett is the week 1 starting quarterback for the Patriots, regardless of who they play against.
I'd agree with that. I think that he gets a bunch of games too. I mean, they need to settle their supporting cast too. Yeah. They're just throwing crap against the wall right now. I mean, their projected 3 receiver set right now is Pop Douglas, Kendrick Bourne, who runs a 4.8 coming off a torn ACL, rookie Jalen Polk. Yeah. They might be starting 3rd round pick Caden Wallace at left tackle. So, I mean, until they feel comfortable with their supporting cast, and I'm usually a big fan of playing quarterbacks right out the gate. Like, you live and you learn, you make mistakes, you learn from it. That's how you get better. That's true development, not watching another guy play. But in this case, I think that they actually should play Brissett as long as they possibly can.
I think that was a good summary of how I feel as well. The Patriots, I do believe, are at the beginning portion now of what they hope will be a new and successful chapter with a lot of change, right? I just think that it's important when you have a quarterback who is this green to not expect that the validation of the pick needs to take place within the first 6 games of the season. Like, it might take us a little while longer to know exactly what Drake May is in the NFL, and that's okay under these circumstances. I loved Polk as a prospect coming out, one of my favorite guys to study. in a different scenario where he was like the number 2 for a team with a more established quarterback, I'd feel better about it. I think he's the Patriots' most talented wide receiver right now. Maybe that is not a massive, massive bar to clear,
Yeah.
but I don't know that there is a significant amount of upside. I just don't know what the touchdown equity will actually be in this offense.
Okay. Let's go to 15th best landing spot, and that is Ricky Pearsall goes to the 49ers. Now, the good news is this is going to be one of the most efficient offenses. He got first round draft capital. The bad news is that ESPN's Nick Wagner reported yesterday, and I thought this was a really good article. I tweeted if people want to check it out, all the different Debo Ayuk scenarios, and he came to the conclusion he does not think that Debo or Ayuk will be traded. I'm curious what you've heard on that front, Field, and do you think Pearsall can have any impact in
It's Pearsall, dude.
Pearsall, there we go.
Not Parasail. Okay, it's Pearsall.
That's the only reason I actually wanted to come on this podcast, was to see all the hear all the pronunciations. Ricky's a baller, by the way. He is sick. I think the only reason why we weren't talking about him a lot more in round 1 is he's going to be 24 this season. And just how many teams are looking to invest in a player at that age in the first round. The Rams did so with Jared Verse. Jaden Daniels is already 23. Penix will be 24 in 6 days from the time that we're having this conversation. But Pearsall is legit. This kid can freaking fly. He's powerful, sick route runner. He's got some nasty to him as well. Everybody knows the great catch radius with that one-handed catch against Charlotte this past college football season. So it's 15 now. If either of those two players were traded, does it jump up to 10? Like, does it jump up to 8? I mean, it's got to be up there, right?
At least.
Yeah.
It might be like top 5.
Yeah.
I mean,
ride the wave here a little bit is what I would say, because obviously nothing has happened. I am not Adam Schefter. I'm not trying to say that I have this all figured out. I've talked to people around the NFL who know the economics of the league backwards and forwards. And everybody has their eyes on San Francisco at some point between now and next offseason, having to make some difficult decisions. Brock Purdy a year from now is extension eligible. I don't care what you think about Brock Purdy. If he gets an extension, it ain't going to be for $25 million a year. It might be twice that. It's the same thing I keep telling people with Tua. People say, Tua regressed down the stretch last year. He's, like $35, $37 million per year. Not how it works, right? When you're looking at Daniel Jones, who's got a $40+ million per year contract, or guys like that just one season ago, Tua led the NFL in passing yards last year. He's going to be an expensive QB. Same with Brock. You pile that on top of CMC, George Kittle, Trent Williams, Nick Bosa, Fred Warner, Javon Hargrave, just to name a few of the 49ers well-compensated players that are at or near the top of their respective positions. Something is going to have to happen. Now, does that mean it has to happen this year? It does not. They can get by this year. But by 2025, Ricky Pearsall is going to be one of the top 2 wide receivers in San Francisco, and an offense that I think we continue to project will be great. I know you said this is like 90% redraft, maybe 5 to 10% dynasty. Dynasty people out there, hold steady on Ricky, because the upside a year from now, like, he might be in the second or third best spot of any rookie wide receiver 1 year from right now.
Yeah. I think, Evan, it's just hard in year 1 if both Debo and Ayuk are there, because this team has been so run heavy. It's hard to even find enough targets for everyone to project. It's like whack-a-mole. And so it's going to be hard for the year 1 stuff on Ricky, but yeah.
Yep.
All right. Let's go to 14. Controversial one in the ETR streets. Our guy, Anthony Amico, was all over Malachi Corley to the Jets. Now, I actually think that it can be a good landing spot. Mike Williams is going to be 30 and coming off an ACL tear. I don't think Alan Lazard can play. My concern, Field, is that Aaron Rodgers has this long history of hating rookies, and he loves Lazard. Lazard's like his boy. And so maybe I'm overestimating Corley's impact here, but how do you think he fits with Rodgers? And what do you think about this landing spot?
Yeah, I think like there's kind of like, the flop the nuts scenario with Malachi, where it's like, he becomes the number 2 pass catcher in this offense behind Garrett Wilson and picks up like 70 catches, even if it's for like 12 yards a catch with like only 5 touchdowns. There's also the scenario that you kind of hinted at, which is that he just gets buried on this depth chart early because at some point during August, when people are saying that Alan Lazard should have been cut, even with the dead money ramifications, Aaron Rodgers comes to his defense with this impassioned plea about how Alan's my guy, and we used to have Thanksgiving dinner together, and he's worked for everything. He's a great story of out of nowhere success. And I tend to think that Lazard's going to have some sort of role. I just do. Like Rodgers and him are as tight as you could possibly be. So I think you've kind of picked like the median outcome here for Malachi. So him and Pearsall to me will be like a healthy debate because I'm not sure either one of them has a decidedly clearer path to a role in their respective offenses.
A Western Kentucky product who won via manufactured touches, going to play with Aaron Rodgers in the big on the big stage. I don't know, man. I have some skepticism there, and I know what they're trying to do. I just feel like this guy makes a couple false moves, in an early season game, and they're calling up Randall Cobb, or they're bringing up Alan Lazard.
Man.
Yeah.
The other big dog might be signed, right? Mercedes Lewis at some point. He's still available, isn't he? Is he retired? He's still available.
Yeah, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Corley did get maybe some light Randall Cobb comps. So I don't know. Maybe Rodgers will like him. We'll see.
Yeah, we got the light Randall Cobb from Western Kentucky as opposed to the real Randall Cobb from just Kentucky.
Exactly. All right, 13 overall in landing spots have Roman Wilson to the Steelers. Now, his draft capital was way after Corley's, right? Roman Wilson goes 84th overall. But the path to playing here is wide open. I mean, behind George Pickens, who I'm not sure is ever going to be a huge volume guy. Behind George Pickens is Van Jefferson, Calvin Austin, Quez Watkins. So I know there's a lot of Roman Wilson fans out there. Field, what do you think about his fit with the Steelers?
By the way, I don't know if you guys saw that Jets video that was released. I love that post-draft coverage by the various teams, by the way. Really cool stuff there. But they talked about how it sounded like it was basically Malachi Corley or Roman Wilson, like maybe late in the second. It's kind of where they were thinking. Sorry for the dog barking there. But I think that Roman Wilson maybe landed in one of the better spots for a guy going in the third round, regardless of position, on top of some of the things that you just mentioned. And this may be bad logic, but the Steelers get the benefit of the doubt from me when it comes to second and third round wideouts. They've just crushed the sweet spot for so long. So if he's good enough in their eyes to be a third round pick, he's good enough in my eyes. My big concerns would be that he's not going to play with a quarterback, regardless of who starts, who at this juncture of his career is like this pure natural pocket rhythm passer. Both Russell Wilson and Justin Fields can be kind of see it, throw it quarterbacks. But other than that, pretty optimistic outlook for a guy who went in the 80s overall.
Yeah, for sure. We're down at 158 overall on Roman Wilson right now. Evan, as his yards per target is not going to be great. Catch rate should be pretty good, though. Any thoughts on Roman Wilson to the Steelers, Evan?
I really liked it as a real life NFL pick, and I don't like it as a fantasy from a fantasy standpoint. I mean, first of all, you're going to start out with a limited passing pie under Arthur Smith. You have a quarterback controversy that seems inevitable, and then you got George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth, Najee Harris, Jalen Warren. All those guys can catch passes. So good. High quality NFL draft pick, and not really a guy that I'm interested in almost at all in fantasy.
I got a quick tangent just to jump in here for a second on something. I really feel like what happened on day 3 this year, first time going through the draft analyst role, reminded me of what happens after about round, 7 or 8, maybe 9 or 10 in fantasy drafts, is that and we call it our late round bucket of flyers in the fantasy focus, where it's just these guys all have A.D. Mitchell versus Roman Wilson. We could debate it, all day. We could each hire a lawyer to make the case for it, and we'd probably both feel like we're winning that argument. And just so hard to decipher, 131 versus 171 on the ETR big board might be kind of the same thing, right? That's why I've always leaned on tiers for players. But it's interesting, talking through some of these guys, they all they're all different, but they all kind of sound the same in the sense that we like the player enough that if things go right, they could have a good year, but there are enough limiting factors that we're still talking about them outside the first 12 selections for rookie landing spots.
For sure. And as we get to 12 here, I think it's an important point because somebody like Jermaine Burton, who we have 12th here on this list, if he hits, he could hit in a really big way because we know how how explosive Joe Burrow can be throwing the football. Now, for dynasty players, Evan and I have already talked about this. Do expect T. Higgins. Oh, Field can comment, but people are like, why wouldn't they just franchise T. Higgins twice? I'm like, that's going to be expensive, especially when you have to sign Jamar Chase. And Field is here to confirm what I've been saying for a while. The salary cap is indeed real, right, Field? And so at some point, you can't just keep franchise tagging T. Higgins over and over again. But what do you think about
who does Tyreek Hill play for now, right? Like, who does Devontae Adams play for now, right?
Exactly.
Those are just two of the many, many examples. I think the discourse is like a bit reductive. You can certainly manipulate the salary cap to do your best to keep a good number of players, but if it were that simple, then we wouldn't have gone 20 plus years without back-to-back champions, as we just did from the 03-04 Patriots to the 23-24 Chiefs. I guess 22-23. You guys get my point, though.
100%.
Yeah. I think T is going to hit the open market at worst next offseason. The other outcome, of course, there are two others. One, he'd be traded. Two, is he would be extended. It sounds like an extension is going to be hard to find that middle ground on. The Bengals have some kind of archaic salary cap and contract structures they continue to abide by for reasons that are above kind of my level of comprehension, a lot of others as well. The tricky part about a T. Higgins trade is that the draft is now behind us. And so if you're Cincinnati, you probably were motivated, if you're going to do that, to do it before the draft so you can help the 2024 version of this team. The other part is that everybody wants to connect T. Higgins to teams in the AFC that are going to compete ostensibly with the Cincinnati Bengals for the conference. Like, they're not trading him to Buffalo. They're not. They just aren't. Like, they're not making the Bills a much better team just to get back a draft pick next year. They're just not going to do that. So I think T is in Cincy for 2024, and I think he hits the open market in 2025, especially because at some point this offseason, we're going to have the start. I guess we had it kind of got it going with Amon-Ra. To be a bunch of contracts signed for wide receivers that makes that wide receiver market in free agency next year look a lot less robust. I think T is going to be the number one wide receiver, maybe the number one player in free agency next year, because we just saw this past year, there's not always a massive headliner in the class.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm the Bengals, this is my window to go all in and win. I'm keeping T. If I'm the 49ers, I still think this 49ers team can win. And I would keep Debo also and figure it out later. Evan, what do you think about the landing spot for Jermaine Burton?
Loved it for Jermaine Burton. And I think Jermaine Burton is a baller. I mean, he's sensational. It's off-field stuff that dropped him to number 80 or whatever.
Yeah.
And
I thought that was high relative to where I expected him to go. Just because this was a guy who there were some teams that felt like the maturity concerns were much deeper than what we discussed with AD, and I thought 80, like talent-wise, much higher than 80. But I thought there was a chance he might fall to day 3.
And the Bengals for a long time were a team that was more than willing to take on character risks in the draft. And then they kind of got away from that. But they must have loved the player here to take him in the 3rd round. And it sucks for Andre
Yoshivas. There you go.
Yoshivas.
Yeah.
Yoshi. We just call him Yoshi.
Yoshi, yeah.
But then people are like, who is Yoshi? So but it's not good for him, but it's a great landing spot for Jermaine Burton. I mean, it was the ultimate landing spot for Jermaine Burton.
All right. Sneaky one that I actually really like, 11 overall, Trey Benson to the Cardinals. And it's cost me so much money being too low on James Conner because this guy's always shoving it down my throat when I think that he can't. But now he's 29. He is like always on the injury report. Trey Benson, I know, had a lot of big fans in the scouting community. We had Mike Renner on. Trey Benson was his number 1 running back in this class. Field number 1 running back in the class was Trey Benson. Also, what do you think about Benson's chances of supplanting James Conner as soon as this year?
I think there's a pocket of games where Trey Benson's the lead back for Arizona. You mentioned Conner, who's never played a full season. Never once in, let me see, count 1, 2, 3. I got the raw stats in front of me. 7 seasons he has never played a full season. Now, he's also played at least 10 games in every year, so it's not like he's had a bunch of significant injuries, but still, there's going to be a chance for Trey Benson at some point. And the player's just too good. Like, this guy is 4.39 with serious tackle breaking and tackle eluding ability. Good in the passing game as well. Had over 11 yards per catch on 25 catches last season for the Seminoles. I love the player, and the offensive line got some work done during the draft. They've now got, they feel better about their tackle group after signing Jonah Williams. Isaiah Adams, one of my draft crushes, their third-round pick out of Illinois, could be a plug-and-play starting guard. So things are looking up. Arizona's an interesting team because I think things are simultaneously looking up, but they also might be the fourth best team in their own division. But Trey Benson, I'm totally in. Like, I think 2025, he has like top 20 running back potential just because the player is really good, and I just don't know how much longer James Conner is around with that franchise.
And just to focus on the trajectory of the organization, I mean, I think it is clearly going upward. Monty Austinford in his 2 drafts, I mean, he's killed both.
He's
of
a
his
baller.
first
Yeah.
2 drafts. He's awesome. He gets like positional value and trading down. Is willing to move up, but not overpay. I think he's been awesome. Kyler Murray, I thought played maybe the best football of his career.
I agree.
Down the stretch last year. Drew Petzing shows a lot of promise as an offensive coordinator. Just to land in a spot like this and James Conner's contract is up after this season.
Is it this year or next? Yeah, it's coming around soon, but like if not this year.
This is his contract year.
There you go. Yeah, tells you everything you need to know.
Yep. So, I think it was a really good landing spot for Trey Benson.
Totally
agree. I thought he was maybe the best running back in the draft.
Yeah. What do you think about his pass catching field?
I think it's good enough. Like, one of the hard parts with college football is sussing out, like, when you see the player's raw stats and you see his usages, do they only use him that much because he's incapable of being used in other ways? Or do they only use him that much because they just didn't need him, right? Like, it's not like the Seminoles lacked pass catchers. They had 3 guys drafted, 2 wide receivers and a tight end and Jaheim Bell. So they've got dudes to catch the football. So my general take is that Trey Benson is he's very natural doing it and absolutely unquestionably can add some juice in that regard of the game.
Okay.
He averaged 11 yards per catch in college. I mean, that's a big number.
He's got a great vision. Like, he's a super patient, like on screens, like super patient, setting up his blocks. The instincts are clear with Trey Benson.
All right. I actually had Trey Benson's landing spot ahead of Jonathan Brooks' landing spot, but after talking to a bunch of people, we wanted to move Brooks' landing spot ahead under the assumption that if his ACL is good, Jonathan Brooks won't have to overcome James Conner. He'll just immediately be ahead of Chuba and Miles Sanders. Now, I don't know how much I believe that. There's going to be Miles Sanders trade rumors out there, Field. What do you think about Jonathan Brooks' health right now and the chances that Miles is traded or Jonathan Brooks just beats out Chuba right away?
As I had heard it sounds like training camp is a realistic target for Jonathan Brooks. That was sort of my understanding during the pre-draft process. As I'm, by the way, pulling up Miles Sanders' contract for this year, I know they already took on that $2 million roster bonus that was guaranteed, as it were. Like, crazier things have happened than somebody like talking themselves into Carolina absorbing some and them absorbing the rest of his base salary for this year. So he could be like a potential trade target at some point. Brooks is an awesome player as well. Like, I got some Aaron Jones vibes on occasion from him, like sort of this slippery, elusive runner, really, really good in the passing game as well. The most concerning part is that, and Stephania Bell has talked about this plenty in the past, there's a lot of data about running backs coming back year 1 from the ACL tear, and it usually is a full season for them to get back up to strength or close to it. I think we saw that with Javonte Williams this past season. Breece Hall obviously got going and better as the season wore on. But most of the time, like, you go back and look at Saquon when he tore his ACL, Dalvin Cook tore his ACL, like that following year for them was lower than where things kind of were at. So I'd say for the most part, like my belief in the player is strong. My belief in the first year expectations is kind of modest.
Yeah, well,
and his ACL happened late. I mean,
November 11th. Yeah.
I mean, but just from a landing spot perspective, to me, like, you have to have serious concerns that Carolina is going to be broken for a while if Bryce Young doesn't turn this thing around. Whereas, like Evan just talked about, I'm excited about the Cardinals offense. So I don't know. I actually might think that Trey Benson's landing spot is actually better, period. But okay. I mean, by the time Jonathan Brooks is healthy, Trey Benson could have already supplanted James Conner, but we'll see.
Yeah.
All right. 9th, we have Rome Odunze to the Bears. Now, long-term, obviously Rome Odunze is going to be a starting wide receiver. Short-term, he has Keenan Allen, DJ Moore there already. So it's interesting, Field, because I think in a lot of wide receiver classes, Rome would have been the first wide receiver off the board. Not in this one, but we shouldn't penalize him for that. What do you think about his landing spot and how he fits with what the Bears want to do on offense?
Yeah, tricky one here. I freaking love the player. I freaking love the pick in real life. And I'm just not so sure that for fantasy football purposes this year, it's going to be a big year for Rome. Because it goes beyond just Keenan Allen and DJ Moore. It's also the fact that they signed Gerald Everett in free agency, Cole Kmet, serviceable starting tight end, DeAndre Swift, a player that's got some legit juice in the passing game. It's possible that Rome is 4th or 5th on the pass catcher depth chart. Now, I'm also fully bracing. Like, this is a good example, and I think this kind of applies to Brock Bowers as well. But the quarterback situation is so much better in Chicago than it is in Vegas, in my opinion, is that sometimes you talk yourself into like what I just sort of described. Like, yeah, you got so many other mouths to feed. But then like push comes to shove. If you told me by the end of this season, and this is going to sound crazy, and I hope it's not disrespectful because I do love DJ Moore. If you told me by the end of this year, it was like, yeah, Rome Odunze is the alpha of that offense. Is that crazy of a thing to say? I don't think it is, but if you guys feel like that's blasphemous, I'm certainly open to it.
I am not enough of a scouting bro to know if that's in the range of outcomes, but from the people that I follow, yes, that definitely sounds like coming out of college.
Stud, he was a 6th best player on my board. Like the guy is freaking
Rome.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, Rome was on paper a way better prospect than DJ Moore coming out of college. Certainly, Evan, what do you think about this landing spot for Rome?
I think my best projection would be that Rome kind of gets off to a little bit of a slow start. Keenan Allen is just sucking in targets.
Yep.
We saw with DJ Moore, we saw his ceiling last year. He was like a top 5 receiver last year. And then at the end of the season, we start to see Rome really come on. And then Keenan Allen is only signed for this year. DJ Moore is only signed through 2025. I don't think DJ Moore is going to go anywhere, okay? But I think that eventually, and I'm a believer in Caleb Williams enough that I think he's going to be able to support 2 wide receiver ones in fantasy. And I think that we can get to that point with DJ Moore and Rome Odunze after Keenan Allen moves on.
Yeah. I mean, we have a pretty good throw rate on the Bears right out of the gate here, and we are up at 59 overall right now on Rome Odunze, right in that kind of Jaden Reed, Terry McLaurin, Marquise Brown range right now for Rome Odunze.
That's more optimistic than I expected, and I like it. I mean, the guy's so freaking good. Like, again, I'm trying to think of a recent comparison where a guy landed in a bad spot and we talked ourselves out of the player a little bit, and then he started balling, and you're like, oh, wait, no, this guy's just freaking nasty. Well, he's too good.
Exactly. And like something that we try to do in the ranks, obviously in fantasy, the later in year is more valuable, right? Like later in the year is where all the money is, and we're trying to backweight some of this stuff. If you think Rome Odunze is going to be better later in the year, that's more valuable points in fantasy later.
You know
in
what?
The year. So,
you guys are way too pragmatic with that kind of content. I tell people this all the time. Like, pockets of the season matter, right? Part of the allure for me for Trey Benson is I think there's going to be a stretch where Trey Benson starts for 4 or 5 games, and he's going to be freaking sick for those 4 or 5 games, right? Like, I don't know if he ended up paying off like this, and this is kind of a damning. It's not a great. Here's a like. Remember late in the season, like Chase Brown got like 1 or 2 spot starts for Joe Mixon, and you're like, oh, this guy was like really good in those opportunities. Now, can you predict exactly when they're going to come? No, but I'm not saying for like for handcuff purposes, but like Chase Brown's good enough that if he got some run, like I'd rather have him as my backup running back than like I don't know. There were players in other spots that just ended up being whatever. Tank Bigsby ended up being not much there, right? Like it's just stuff like that. The pockets matter a whole lot more than people give them credit for.
Exactly. And like James Conner is likeliest to get hurt a little bit into the season when you're already dealing with bye weeks and injuries around your team. And so,
totally. Yep.
All right. 8 overall have Brian Thomas Jr. to the Jaguars. Now, they since cut Evans' boy, Zay Jones.
Good player.
They did add Gabe. Wait, did you say good player on Zay
Jones?
Yeah,
wait, what?
Yeah.
Hey, Luke, can we delete that?
It's your boy. It's your guy, Zay. Just want to make sure you're awake over there.
They did add Gabe Davis. They still have Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram. Obviously, they'll get at least good, maybe not great, but good quarterback play or reasonable quarterback play out of Trevor Lawrence. So how do you think Brian Thomas fits with what the Jaguars do on offense field.
Yeah, the problem I have with the signing is that with the selection, as far as fantasy value is concerned, is like he's got kind of a replicable skill set as to what like Gabe Davis does. Obviously, the Jaguars are hoping for like a higher ceiling for BT and a more consistent player. But he was at his best this past year, just running past people down the field. His only game where he was really asked to be like an underneath receiver was the bowl game against Wisconsin when Jaden Daniels didn't play. But he had 17 receiving touchdowns last year, and I got to imagine at least half of them were like 20-plus yard catches or a whole lot longer. So I will be curious to see which of those two, Brian Thomas Jr. or Gabe Davis, is not asked to just basically like occupy space down the field. Whichever one doesn't have to do that has legit fantasy value, because I think he'll be the second most valuable wide receiver in this offense, which has been able to prop two separate wide receivers and Evan Ingram over the past couple of years. But if it ends up being Gabe Davis who's asked to do that as opposed to Brian Thomas Jr., then I think things are quite murky.
I mean, if you spend the number 23 overall pick on
a
a guy that can't beat out Gabe Davis, I think you have a problem. Evan, what do you think about Brian Thomas's landing spot here?
I really like it because I think he has a chance to be like Trevor Lawrence's long-term number one receiver. I mean, he's got that kind of ability.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, we'll see. I think that he's another guy who might start slow. You know, you got Ingram there. Christian Kirk is a target hog. Gabe Davis, they gave a lot of money to. And then Brian Thomas maybe comes on down the stretch.
All right. 7th best landing spot. And maybe people wanted me to move this one higher. So I'm open to being wrong here. But Chargers take Ladd McConkey, top of the 2nd round here. Now, what you get into, obviously the opportunity is amazing. I'm curious if Field thinks Quentin Johnston is revivable at all or he's just stone dead. But regardless, you have Josh Palmer, you have Quentin Johnston. Maybe they could sign Tyler Boyd. But it's clearly, from a volume perspective, or at least from an opportunity perspective, it's a great landing spot for Ladd McConkey. My concern, of course, is that we're going to have like a Falcons situation where they run the ball when they're not supposed to be running the football, when they're down 14 in the 4th quarter and they're sitting there running the football like the Falcons were. That's my concern, and that would make it not the best landing spot. So a lot of Chargers stuff going on here, Field. What do you think about what they're doing in the landing spot for Ladd McConkey?
I'd be curious what the number you could get on right now for Ladd to lead all rookie pass catchers in receptions next year. Because I'd take that number there, right? Like as kind of a dark horse candidate. All the receivers that we've talked about so far, and there's going to be one that we will eventually discuss who's certainly the favorite for a reason. But Ladd's the best receiver on this team already. His quarterback is obviously nice. Justin Herbert's a stud. They're going to run the football a ton, no doubt. But I mean, you're going to have to throw it some, right? Even if you're, 27th in the NFL in passing attempts, like you're still going to have to throw the football enough to make at least one guy relevant. And if it's not Ladd, I just don't know who it is in that offense. He's going to absolutely crush in the intermediate passing game, short area passing game. And then he's got the speed to be a vertical threat as well. His yak is ridiculous. 4.39 40. I was a huge fan of the player from the jump. It was a great landing spot, in my opinion. I'm in.
Josh Palmer, Quentin Johnston, 2 7th-round picks. Will Dissly, Hayden Hurst, Donald Parham.
Who's taking over the lead besides Ladd there?
Right.
It's tough, man. Tough time right now.
Do you think that Ladd is going to be an outside receiver long-term in the NFL, or do you think he'll be a slot guy, Field?
I think he'll be both. I think he'll be like, whether it's Devontae, whatever you want to call your favorite inside-outside receiver, like he'll just play enough on both because he certainly can run routes. Like when he came back, his first game back last year, I believe, was against Auburn, first game back, and they've got 2 guys who were drafted 5th and 6th round or 4th and 6th round, Nehemiah Pritchard and DJ James, both of the Seahawks actually. And he was just carving those dudes up like as an outside perimeter receiver. Like his route running was as good as there was for any player in the class, maybe along with Rome Odunze, Marvin Harrison Jr. But because of the size, he's 189 pounds, is Ladd. Like there's going to be some slot opportunities for him as well because the size and the short area quickness caters so well to that slot role.
Nate Tice and Mike Renner both compared Ladd to
AB,
Emmanuel
right?
Sanders, who was a 50-50, half the time slot, half the time outside. So that's how I would project Ladd.
That's a good comp, by the way. I love that one.
All right. 6th overall, we have J.J. McCarthy landing with the Vikings. This has been incredible fantasy spot for quarterback play. I mean, even Nick Mullins, even Josh Dobbs had some big fantasy games
Mullins threw for like 400 plus last
it's
year, right?
crazy.
The game
And
against the Lions, he had, I think, 3 first half interceptions
yeah,
and still ended up with like 13 and a half fantasy points, which not a big number, but when you throw the ball to the other team 4 times over
yeah.
4 quarters, not ideal.
And so JJ McCarthy gets dropped into this spot where they're going to re-sign Justin Jefferson long term, I assume. I think they have a pretty decent hit in Jordan Addison. TJ Hawkins will be back at some point. They're in the dome. The defense still stinks, and they're going to be in all these crazy shootouts. They're going to be among the leaders in pass rate over expectation. It's a great spot if you think JJ McCarthy can play. And also, you have to think, is he going to start right away? They do have Sam Darnold there. So, Field, I'm curious what you think there, Darnold versus McCarthy, and how McCarthy can win in fantasy in Minnesota.
Here's the good news. If JJ's not starting, it's because Sam balled out. I just don't think that Sam, he hasn't played enough. He hasn't held the job for long enough that it feels like he deserves the starting job no matter what during training camp. I don't want to equate these, they're not the perfect comparison, but we were talking about Jacoby Brissett and Drake May in New England. I think the parallel is loses steam here between those two situations because Brissett's the guy who has overcome and he's overachieved relative to his draft position, right? A 3rd round pick. Like Sam Darnold, the 3rd overall pick, has underachieved. I think innately that creates a dynamic in the locker room where it's even if Jacoby doesn't have the flash as Drake May does during training camp, it's hey, is Jacoby still the guy, the veteran leader?
Right.
Whereas with JJ, if he looks good, damn good, and Sam looks just okay, it's all right, maybe there's a reason why Sam keeps, being passed around the NFL and on short-term contracts 1 year after 1 year. So I think JJ does start right away.
Yeah. And that is an exciting landing spot, Evan. I mean, I said, we've seen some huge quarterback performances from guys who are not very good at the quarterback position. So pretty exciting for sure. Let me check where we're at on him. Yeah, we have him splitting some starts right now. So we're way down at quarterback 25. If we changed it and gave JJ McCarthy 17 starts in the projections, we'd certainly have him way, way higher.
Yeah.
For sure. All right. Let's go to 5th overall, Malik Neighbors, Giants. Now, there's kind of competing factors here. Of course, quarterback play is a concern. Your quarterback options are Daniel Jones and Drew Lock. But from opportunity standpoint, I think Darren Waller's retiring. I don't know if Fields heard anything there. It seems like Darren Waller is retiring. And then they don't really have many other wide receivers that can command targets. So I think pretty good landing spot for Malik Neighbors if Drew Lock and Daniel Jones can just keep their heads on straight. Field, what do you think about Neighbors' landing spot?
Yeah, just quickly on Darren Waller, the lack of a commitment this far into the season or into the offseason, to me is a sign of just how real the possibility of him retiring actually is. I don't know anything more than has been reported, but I'm not going to be surprised if he ultimately walks away from the game of football, which, by the way, given his journey, would be a hell of a career for that guy.
Sure, for sure.
Yeah. But this might be one where it's you got to ignore the circumstances, you got to ignore the surroundings, and just place all your faith in the player. I mean, I know that he ended up not being the first wide receiver taken, but I'm just, I'm here to sort of validate what was said so frequently during the pre-draft process, which is that it's a legit conversation at the top of the board at wide receiver between he and Marvin Harrison Jr. So as we were talking about with Rome, could he eventually just become the alpha in that passing game? It's not a guarantee, but it's possible. Neighbors, they could just say, let's just manufacture touches for him from the jump in a wide receiver room that scares nobody. Whether it's Drew Lock or Daniel Jones, we don't care. This kid's way too explosive to not make the focal point of the offense.
Yeah, and I think that his deployment under Brian Daboll is going to remind people a lot of Stephon Diggs during his peak years in Buffalo. Daniel Jones and Drew Lock aren't so bad that they can't get the ball to Malik Neighbors. He's going to do a lot of high percentage stuff. Yeah. I mean, I think Neighbors is going to crush in fantasy right out the gate. I intend to be higher on him than consensus in my first top 150 rankings.
Okay. 4th overall in landing spots, went with Caleb Williams here. I mean, normally number 1 picks are just drafted into the worst possible situations, no weapons, horrible team. You're going to be just in these known passing situations all the time. I think the Bears could be pretty good. I already took that Matt Eberflus 20-1 coach of the year. On paper, I think it's the best supporting cast, number one pick.
Yep.
Will have Field. What do you think about Caleb's chances of immediate success? Because we're up pretty high here on Caleb. We have him as our QB 12 right now, 94 overall, and that's redraft, obviously. So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I believed during the pre-draft process, like part of my role as an analyst was not to just try to blend in on every guy with where everybody else had him, but to sometimes push your chips to the middle of the table on a player. And I think Caleb is going to be that guy for me in fantasy, which is, obviously that wouldn't have been bold during the draft process, right? But it's a little bold during the fantasy process, right? The player is so freaking talented. I mean, he was wire to wire, clear cut number one player in the country for me. Never felt like the gap closed so much that it was a real conversation for Chicago. And he's got the dual threat ability. He's a real part of the reason why we didn't talk as much about his running during the pre-draft process is that Jaden Daniels is like baby Lamar. But yeah, I mean, Caleb's in such a good spot here. I mean, the pieces are in place, as you alluded to, that I think he'll hover right around, like he and Jaden will both hover close to quarterback 10 for me this year, right away.
Yeah.
I like that. And, there is no threat of any quarterback playing ahead of him, even for a few games.
Yep.
With J.J. McCarthy, you got Sam Darnold. With Drake May, you got Jacoby Brissett. With Michael Penix, you got Kirk Cousins.
Yep.
With Bo Nix, you got Stidham. Tyson Bagent is the Bears' number 2 quarterback.
Is he really?
And he's not going to be starting any games. Yeah. So, and I mean, I think the Bears' offensive line is underrated. A lot of people around here, they're like, oh, yeah, but they're not going to be able to protect them, though. And I'm like, did you see the way that Justin Fields played? I mean, he put so much stress on the offensive line for how long it took for him to process what was in front of him and get the ball out of his hands. I think the Bears' offensive line is going to be like a top 15 unit this year. And
that's all it has to be, right?
Yeah, that's all you need.
Yeah,
all
right. He and both Russell Wilson and Justin Fields are good case studies in assigning sacks exclusively to the offensive line, right? Like it frequently is the quarterback and not just the offensive line.
Oh, sacks are a quarterback stat for sure.
No two ways about it. Yep.
All right. Third best landing spot. Everybody was wondering, who are the Bills going to take? Which wide receiver are the Bills going to take? They need weapons so bad. They move on from Gabe Davis and Steph Diggs in the same offseason. It turns out they trade back twice and end up with Keon Coleman. So they're desperate for like an alpha number 1. Field, do you think Keon Coleman is that? And what kind of year 1 impact do you think he'll have on the Bills?
I think he has the chance to be that, but I don't think he has a choice. He has to be that right away. And so, like, they're going to make this one happen here. I love the player. I mean, the 4.61 40. 40s matter except for when they don't. I know that's kind of a lame way of putting it, but like, they can help break some ties. But like, if a guy's a star football player and he runs a slow 40, I'm not going to totally ignore it. But Keon Coleman at 4.61, yes, I hear that. He's got awesome vision, so good after the catch, really good instincts. Everybody knows this, probably that's listening to this podcast, but at the combine, when they did the gauntlet drill, which I think is a more accurate reflection of how fast you're playing, he's the fastest wide receiver in the gauntlet drill and the GPS tracking. The playing above the rim dynamic that he brings to the table is real. He was literally a basketball player in college at Michigan State. He's going to be a red zone weapon for them. So I'm in big on Keon Coleman as well.
We have him 86th overall right now, Evan, right next to Curtis Samuel, who they signed. Maybe that's not optimistic enough on Keon Coleman, but yeah, go ahead on this landing spot.
So you remember Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott came from Carolina, and in Carolina they had Cam Newton.
Yep.
And when they drafted Josh Allen, they internally compared Josh Allen to Cam Newton. Who was Cam Newton's first big? Well, he had Steve Smith, but his first big receiver was Kelvin
Benjamin, baby. Let's go.
Who turned out to not be that good. Also went to Florida State, by the way, just like Keon Coleman.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be not that good, but he was forced into that number 1 receiver role and force-fed. He had 73 catches for 1,008 yards and 9 touchdowns as a rookie. I think that is within Keon Coleman's range of potential outcomes.
Late in the year, the Bills went very run heavy and they started to win a bunch more games. When they went on their run, they were running the ball a ton. I don't think they're going to run the ball that much out of the gate, but it's at least in the bag for them to be way more run heavy than maybe some people are projecting, which is why maybe the landing spot's not as great, but it's obviously very, very, very strong.
Yeah.
All right.
This is really good here.
Number 2, Marvin Harrison to the Cardinals. I don't think there's really a lot to say here. They needed an alpha. He has Kyler Murray. They play in good weather for almost all of their games. It just seems like a smash landing spot for Marvin Harrison. And I like that the Cardinals stuck and took Marvin Harrison here. Field, what do you think of the pick and how Marvin Harrison immediately impacts Arizona?
Yeah, I thought he should be number one. Truthfully, there. Other than the fact that the guy who will go number one on this list has a better quarterback, pretty much everything else goes in the favor of Marvin Harrison Jr. Better player, better situation in terms of potential likely target share. Does everything well. They'll manufacture touches for him. They'll create stuff both at or near the line of scrimmage and also down the field for Marv. Evan was saying how Kyler played the best football maybe of his career down the stretch last season, or at least, some of the best football of his career. So I would end up leaning towards, I would lean towards Marvin Harrison Jr. as my number one rookie landing spot, but I get why the guy who will actually be number one is so appealing as well.
For sure. And Evan,
Kyler can rip it outside the numbers too. I mean, you think about that year that DeAndre Hopkins had when he had over 1,400 yards with Kyler. I mean, I think Marvin Harrison is going to play that role. And maybe even be better than DeAndre Hopkins was in it.
All right. Drum roll, please, for the number 1 landing spot among the rookies. I had Xavier Worthy to the Chiefs. Now, Field has me backtracking this a little bit. Obviously, an awesome landing spot. He's going to play with Patrick Mahomes, and there's certainly opportunity. But you start thinking about things that have happened. I mean, Sky Moore failed massively with Patrick Mahomes. Mecole Hardman was a second-round pick, I believe, of the Mahomes era. He mostly failed. MVS failed. Kadarius Toney, maybe fault of his own, but he's failed also. So it's not like just because you play with Patrick Mahomes means you're automatically a superstar. So I don't want to overrate the landing spot here for Xavier Worthy, but in terms of where we would have had Worthy ranked on X team versus where Worthy is ranked on the Chiefs, the delta there is just absolutely massive. Field, what do you think Xavier Worthy's year 1 impact here is? We know Rashee Rice could be suspended as soon as this year. We know Kelsey will be back. We know they have Marquise Brown now.
Yeah, I'm totally bracing for the possibility of night 1, which of course will be Thursday night. Chiefs playing in that game. Game 1 of the season opener was the defending champs. 75-yard touchdown pass to Xavier Worthy, right? Doesn't that just feel fitting? Because of the fact that the Chiefs got the fastest guy on the planet, because of the fact that the Bills had the pick that Xavier Worthy went with, and they've been, the Chiefs have been their white whale, right? Like, they haven't been able to overcome the Chiefs, even when everything seemed to tilt in the Bills' favor. They can't solve the Chiefs. It feels like Worthy's going to go off in game 1. My concerns relative, which would be, the difference between him being 1 or 2 on this list is what you alluded to. Just that there are a few more mouths to feed. And while Hollywood Brown has been inconsistent as a player in his career, still has had some big seasons on his ledger. And if the strengths of their 2 games are kind of identical, they might be jockeying for snaps early on in the season.
Yeah. From a longer term perspective, Marquise Brown is only signed through this season.
Mm-hmm.
Rashee Rice is in danger of being suspended. Travis Kelsey did just get a 2-year extension, but he turns 35 in October.
Yep.
Patrick Mahomes isn't going anywhere, and neither is Xavier Worthy for the next 4 or 5 years.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he's locked in there. The comp that Andy Reid, I think the best comp for him is not necessarily Tyreek Hill for Xavier Worthy. I think it's Deshaun Jackson, who Andy Reid, of course, had in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
And Andy Reid has always kind of tinkered with gadget manufactured touch players, very often without success. I mean, you think about DeAnthony Thomas and Kadarius Toney; those guys haven't worked out, but Xavier Worthy can do those kind of things. And people get worried about him facing press coverage. The Chiefs use motion at the highest rate in the NFL, so that's one way for them to get Xavier Worthy off of physical press coverage. I think this is going to be a success for Andy Reid and for Xavier Worthy in Kansas City.
Okay. There you have it. The top 20 landing spots for rookies ranked from 20 to 1. I did have 3 leftover questions here to hit real quick. First, we didn't mention Jaden Daniels or Ben Sinnott. Field. I don't know what there's to say about Jaden Daniels because he's going to create so many fantasy points just on his own. I don't think it's a scheme-based thing, but he does come into a situation that has Terry McLaurin at least as an alpha wide receiver. What do you think about the landing spots for Jaden, and Ben Sinnott?
Yeah, Senat was probably fine. I just don't know that, like, I guess last year Sam Laporta is kind of the exception to the rule about rookie success early in their career, but I didn't have Senat in my first 15 tight ends in my early run of ranks. Jaden was kind of situation agnostic just because, as you said, he's going to create so many fantasy points with his legs. There's nowhere he could have gone where I would have said he has no chance to become a fantasy rock star because he might lead the NFL in quarterback rushing yards next season.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because there's some people out there that think his frame is some more slender than Lamar, and he's not going to run as much as Lamar. You think that
He's
he is
going to
on
run a
Lamar
lot.
tier?
He not only that, and this is like maybe a little nerdy, but like LSU has like really advanced like sports science and just like a great like sort of like medical team there. And there's been talk about like how I've heard this about how like Jaden, yeah, he's slender, but he's like Gumby. His elasticity is just like really rare, which I know that's going to be like one of those. Again, that sounds really nerdy when I say it, but like maybe he's built to last more than your typical quarterback with that kind of body armor.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Evan, I know you wanted to talk about the landing spot for Jalen Wright. We talked about it a little bit on the last podcast, but Jalen Wright landed with the Dolphins. Evan wanted to highlight that one. Go ahead, Evan.
Your guy.
Well, first, the Dolphins traded a third-round pick next year to draft Jalen Wright in the mid to late fourth round. So they obviously really, really wanted him. And anytime I see Mike McDaniel really, really wants a guy, like, yeah, Raheem Mostert is 32 years old. Devin Achane has had injury problems.
Yeah.
And Jalen Wright, I mean, he doesn't have the cleanest profile. He never had more than 150 carries in a season in college. Why was that? We brought Mike Renner on. He kind of explained it as ball security and pass protection.
Yep.
But this guy can absolutely fly. He's got plenty of size, and we typically look for like workhorse backs in fantasy. And he's not going to be that, but the Dolphins have shown you don't have to be like a full-time every down back to be a highly productive producer in that Dolphins offense, especially at the running back position.
Last question before we get you out of here, Field. I'm looking for ways to bet against Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. I just don't think they're like good, right? So the Chargers took this kid, Kimani Vidal.
Yeah, there we go.
Vidal, a round 6 rookie out of Troy. Now, I don't like to get excited about round 6 rookies. I think that people in fantasy community get way too excited about this stuff. However, this team's going to run the ball a ton, and I don't even think J.K. Dobbins is going to end up being healthy. Gus Edwards, 29, and a bowling ball. So is there any hope for this kid, Kimani Vidal?
I like the player. Here's the caveat. One of his best traits is he's amongst the best pass protecting running backs, if not the best in the entire class. You could just see the Chargers being gravitating towards that part of his skill set. I think it's going to end up being the smorgasbord backfield. And I think that Gus Edwards might average 3.7 yards per carry, but have 12 rushing touchdowns next season.
Yeah.
That's what I'm bracing for. Like, I'm not thrilled about this backfield at all.
You think about Blake Corum, you think about how Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman probably appreciate the ability to pass protect. So that's a really good nugget there on Vidal.
Yeah, it's one of the strengths of his game. Now, he had a great year last. He had 5 rushing touchdowns in the Sun Belt Conference Championship game. Like, he was a stud for Troy. I believe he was second in the FBS in rushing yards last season. But I would be surprised if right out of the gates he could handle a significant workload, significant enough at least to make him fantasy relevant.
For sure. All right, we have said it all on rookie landing spots. Thanks so much to Field for being here. Ton of great information. Field, tell the people where they can find you anywhere you want to be found.
Yeah, I say most of my stuff that I put out ends up being filtered through Twitter at Field Yates. So that's probably the best thing I can plug here.
Yep, at Field Yates. I'm sure you're all following him already, but if you're not, you need to rectify that immediately. Thanks so much to Field for being here.
All right, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Field. For Evan, for producer Luke, for producer Ryan. I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.